Es ella, mujer, como son. En el cuadrante superior. Tónica. Nombres. Es importante que estamos vayando.
A esta sexta mesa del segundo Coloquio Internacional de Primavera del Programa Universitario de Gobierno. Es para nosotros un gusto recibirles el día de hoy. El día de hoy en este foro experimental José Luis Ibáñez de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras para dialogar de manera híbrida sobre un desafío común: cómo gobernar cuando los riesgos no solo crecen en escala, sino en complejidad e incertidumbre. Quisiera comenzar dándole el micrófono al doctor Eduardo Robledo, el coordinador del programa de gobierno, para que nos ofrezca unas palabras de bienvenida.
Muchas gracias, maestra Flavia Tudela, nuestra secretaria académica de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras y coordinadora de esta mesa. A la maestra, a la arquitecta Miriam Ursúa, muchas gracias por su presencia, por su participación. Y por supuesto a nuestros tres ponentes que tendremos hoy el gran privilegio de escucharles a partir de sus grandes experiencias. Muchas gracias a todas las alumnas, todos los alumnos, a los maestros, a las maestras que nos acompañan, de manera especial a los alumnos, a las alumnas, porque son la razón de ser del Programa Universitario de Gobierno, de la Facultad y de la propia UNAM. Por ello, permítame unos breves comentarios. Al darles la bienvenida a este foro experimental, José Luis Ibáñez, de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la UNAM, un lugar en donde ocurren eventos irrepetibles. Y esa irreversibilidad que en el teatro es poesía, en el gobierno es la naturaleza más cruda del riesgo existencial. Las decisiones que no se toman hoy no se pueden ya tomar mañana. Los umbrales que se cruzan no tienen regreso. Es por eso que importa lo que digamos aquí. Y no es casualidad que esta conversación ocurra precisamente en una facultad, en nuestra Facultad de Filosofía, porque ante lo irreversible, ante lo que no admite error, la humanidad siempre ha recurrido a la misma disciplina, la que se niega a dar respuestas cómodas y se obliga a hacer las preguntas que todos evitan. ¿Qué le debemos a las generaciones que aún no existen? ¿Qué significa gobernar responsablemente cuando las consecuencias de nuestras decisiones se despliegan muchas veces en décadas, si no es que en siglos? ¿Qué valor tiene la civilización que hemos construido? ¿Y qué estamos dispuestos a hacer para protegerla. En congruencia con lo anterior, el programa universitario de gobierno que me honro en dirigir celebra con profunda satisfacción que la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras haya iniciado el proceso para la creación del Centro de Riesgos Globales y Existenciales. Será seguramente un espacio que nacerá con la vocación de pensar los problemas más grandes que enfrenta la humanidad con el rigor, la profundidad y la libertad que solo la filosofía puede aportar. Gracias a la doctora Marifrancis Rodríguez Van Gort, nuestra directora de esta facultad, por esa decisión, por esa vocación, por esa voluntad valiente y visionaria. Me permitiré hacer el intento de contestar el por qué es urgente, ya que los datos son contundentes. Brevemente, en el 2015, la Fundación de los Desafíos Globales, en colaboración con la Universidad de Oxford, publicó su estudio de los 12 riesgos que amenazan a la humanidad. En ese ranking, la mala gobernanza mundial aparecía en el número 12. Era reconocida como un riesgo, pero relegada al final de la lista y opacada por el cambio climático, por las armas nucleares, por las pandemias, por la crisis financiera, por la nanotecnología, por el crecimiento de volcanes, por el riesgo de la caída de un asteroide, en fin. 10 años después, solo 10 años después, el panorama ha cambiado dramáticamente. El informe de riesgos globales 2025 del Foro Económico Mundial, elaborado con la opinión de más de 900 líderes mundiales, indica la fragmentación de la gobernanza global, o sea, una mala gobernanza, y le ubica como el riesgo sistémico de mayor impacto a largo plazo. Ya no es el número 12, es el número 1, el riesgo que amplifica a todos los demás. Porque el cambio climático, la inteligencia artificial, las armas de destrucción masiva, las pandemias y las demás, ninguno de esos riesgos puede enfrentarse sin una buena gobernanza. Y cuando la gobernanza falla, todos los demás riesgos se vuelven inmanejables. Hoy tenemos con nosotros, tanto de manera virtual como de manera presencial, a quienes han dedicado su vida intelectual, su vida académica, su vida profesional a entender esta brecha. La doctora Sonja Madé llegó a Cambridge guiada por una pregunta que le persiguió desde niña cuando aprendió sobre el reloj del apocalipsis. ¿Cómo se gobierna el riesgo de que la humanidad se destruya a sí misma? Política científica, guerra nuclear, cambio climático, inteligencia artificial. Su trabajo en el Centro para el Estudio de Riesgo Existencial de Cambridge busca no solo publicar investigación, sino mitigar el riesgo, pasar de la comprensión a la acción. El doctor Seth Baum cofundó el Instituto de Riesgos Catastróficos Globales en 2011 con una misión: desarrollar las mejores maneras de enfrentar las amenazas más graves de la humanidad. Su trabajo cruza la física, la geografía, la ética, la política pública, porque los riesgos catastróficos no respetan disciplinas y las soluciones tampoco pueden hacerlo. Sir David Spingelhalter, caballero de la Corona Británica, por sus servicios a la estadística médica, autor del bestseller El Arte de la Estadística, ha pasado su carrera respondiendo una pregunta que parece muy simple, pero que por supuesto no lo es. ¿Cómo se comunica el riesgo de manera que la gente pueda entenderlo, creerlo y actuar en consecuencia? Sin esa capacidad, los mejores análisis del mundo no sirven para mucho. Tres perspectivas distintas, un solo problema central. ¿Cómo gobernar lo que no podemos predecir, pero sí podemos anticipar? Y tenemos afortunada presencia de dos comentaristas que participan de manera presencial, a la arquitecta Miriam Ursúa Venegas, quien ha dedicado por lo menos los últimos 40 años de su vida a este tema. Ella, como secretaria de Gestión Integral de Riesgos y Protección de la Ciudad de México, no solo estudia, analiza, conoce, vive y padece los riesgos todos los días. Y por supuesto, la maestra Flavia Tudela, secretaria académica de nuestra facultad, quien también profesionalmente ha dedicado toda su vocación, su interés, su talento al estudio de este tema. El PUGOP, el Programa Universitario de Gobierno, y la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras comparten la convicción de que nuestra universidad y por lo tanto todas y todos los que estamos aquí tenemos una responsabilidad impostergable ante los riesgos existenciales. No la de alarmar, sino la de iluminar. No la de paralizar, sino la de preparar. Y ser conscientes de que el arte de gobernar en tiempos de incertidumbre exige, como primer paso, tener el valor de mirar de frente lo que más nos amenaza. Y estando en este foro experimental de teatro, digamos que empiece la función. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Pues muchas gracias. Entonces, vamos a empezar con las participaciones de las personas que nos acompañan a distancia. Y muchas gracias, doctor Robledo, por hacer una introducción pues inicial de los ponentes. Me gustaría leerles una semblanza un poquito más técnica de Sonia Amadae. Ella es directora del Centro de Estudios para los Riesgos Existenciales en Inglaterra. Realizó sus estudios de licenciatura en Reed College y el doctorado en gobernanza por Harvard. Su formación académica se ha centrado en el análisis de la teoría política moderna, la historia de las ideas y el desarrollo de modelos racionales aplicados a las ciencias sociales. Sus investigaciones han tenido un importante impacto en el análisis crítico de los modelos de decisión, el cálculo estratégico y las teorías de juegos. En este sentido, la doctora Amadei ha influido por la formulación de políticas públicas, la estrategia militar y la teoría democrática contemporánea. Es autora de los libros Prisoners of Reason, Game Theater and Neoliberal Political Economy y Rationalizing Capitalist Democracy. Sin más, le damos el micrófono, doctora Amadei.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to be sharing slides, so I'm going to share the screen first and set up my slides. Is that working? Can I get some feedback? I've lost the visual. Oh, wait, maybe. Usually I'm able to play and not have it in this mode. Let me try once again. For some reason, I can't see. Is this all right if I just speak like this?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Well, I'm really delighted and honored to be here. And as I put together my remarks, I came up with my own thinking of approaching this topic of governance with respect to existential futures, thinking through different ones. And then specifically, I'm going to be focusing on the challenges of unilateralism. So muchas gracias. I can't overstate how delighted I am that you would ask me to be a speaker. And I'm just going to tell you what I'm going to talk through. So I'm just going to say a brief statement about how to define existential risk, then key areas of existential risk, but then I'm going to move on to this existential risk, global catastrophic risk, and our moment where we are right now, including what's already been said, the way these risks, they amplify, they cascade, they have complex effects with each other. And I want to focus specifically on unilateralism as why we're having this challenge of the breakdown of good governance. Then I'm going to touch on climate crisis, unilateralism and nuclear weapons, and then talking about some ways to mitigate risk through multilateralism. So I think this will be pretty well known because, of course, everyone in the room is already familiar, but just to recall that existential risk are those events that kill 90% or more of Earth's population and destroy human civilization as it is known today. So a large-scale nuclear war or even a nuclear winter from a limited exchange. And then global catastrophic risk seriously disrupts and could collapse human civilization as we know it, and billions of people could die. As we also know, there's both the categories of natural catastrophic risks and human-generated risks. So we have an asteroid could hit the Earth. We are constantly aware that volcanoes can have a big disruptive effect. We know pandemics can be just naturally developing. But I think that those would all need governance. There's no question. We would need good governance to address those. But when we think of nuclear weapons, climate change, artificial intelligence, and human-engineered pandemics, then governance is implicated multiple times over. So in terms of being at Caesar, I think it has just been said very eloquently at the beginning that if we look at the last slide, so nuclear weapons, climate change, AI, human-engineered pandemics, they were the focus of where Caesar has been spending its research efforts. But it is true that just over the last 2 years, we're beginning to add this governance question so that it would be a fifth category. So in terms of governance, I was attending a couple events over the last 2 days, and governance, of course, is a very, very huge topic. One could get a PhD in just a small area of governance. So I decided that to have a focal point for trying to diagnose where we're failing with governance, this idea of unilateralism would be a good focus because I believe that it is right now that when we are looking at the breakdown of governance, whether it is within one nation or the breakdown of governance in international affairs, then it seems as though what is very disruptive is single actors that are not playing by the rules. What are those rules? They're the international rules-based order and inclusive constitutional democracy. So that then when we ask these questions, why are those in crisis? Why do we see the rise of multilateralism? And how does contemporary unilateralism build on past cases of unilateralism? It didn't just happen today. Today is not the first time in global history that we've seen an example of either national leaders acting unilaterally overseas or problems of unilateralism within a given state. So let's put those questions on the table for a bit and then stand back and let us consider the question of unilateralism and the climate crisis. I think that it's not really controversial to look at the map and to consider the state of the Paris Agreement, that when we look at the map in 2026 and we look at who which states are the ones that are not helping to contribute to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, then it's pretty obvious that it seems to be one primary actor, and that would be the United States. So in this case, I think it's relatively easy and straightforward to say that it is the United States case of unilateralism that is really causing problems and pessimism to do with maintaining the Paris Agreement and actually addressing the emissions of greenhouse gases. So if we look at that, though, then this idea that there's something unique about America, I'm sure that we've all heard that term American exceptionalism, and that goes into this idea that I put forward on the last slide, that usually there's something about today, the unilateralism today probably has some kind of seeds in the unilateralism of the past. And I think that the fact that there is this exception right now, this American exceptionalism, that's very evident with the Paris Agreement, perhaps this US case is the case that breaks the rule. And as that cliche goes, if you have one case that breaks the rules, then it shows that there is a rule. And what would that rule be? The rule is that multilateralism is actually an effective tool of governance. And then to just poke a little deeper in this concept of unilateralism, we can see that unilateralism can be associated with gendered and ethnic hierarchies, and supporters of unilateralism often will make arguments that say it's natural, it's inherent in the natural and the social order. There's been conditions of hierarchy between, for example, enslaved people or non-enslaved people, or men and women, or between different countries. It's age old and we can't do anything about it. So that raises the question of how do we stand up to the unilateralists? And the recommendation, this is only a 20-minute talk, but to consider that we continue to have faith in and to seek out multi-layered institutions, multilateral institutions, accords. And I just want to give one rather optimistic example that comes from Brazil, that Brazil has initiated this tropical forests forever facility in a way to make action that can happen even if one actor is going against the grain. And we can see this in different contexts. We know in the state of California in the United States, even when the federal government of the United States backs off regulating carbon emissions, the state of California has been able to maintain a higher standard. So multilateralism is a way to act in your own community or at the national level with like-minded actors to pursue good models of governance, even in the face of challenges through unilateral actors. So then to move on, I also want to touch on governance unilateralism. I just wanted to come back because I'd posed those questions. Why is the international rules-based order and inclusive constitutional democracy in crisis? And I want to point to this idea that unilateral action, say by the United States and maybe some other nations, I'll just stay with that one for now, that those actors attempt to normalize and raise the prospect for the rest of us that this is the new normal. There's nothing we can do about it. It creates chaos. And then if we start to believe that's inevitable, this is a self-fulfilling, cynical approach that will just spiral downward. And I'm going to throw out there, this is consistent with my own research. Why do we see the rise of unilateralism from 2010 onward? I would argue, and I've written papers about this, that neoliberal globalization had embedded within it a kind of a structural violence that extracted resources from anyone that was lower in the pyramid and would raise those resources to the upper, ultimately to the global elite. So as we know, something like the top 1% of the Earth's population owns something like 50% of the global resources, or at least control them. So that if we then look at I'm going to really go out there on a limb, but if we look at the election that led to the second Trump successful president being in office the second time in 2024, that election, then we can ask ourselves, well, why was that possible? People knew what this president would be like. We'd seen what had happened. There'd been the January 6th event. And I think that we could say that for people who are people, powers, countries, doesn't really matter, any group that has been used to holding a certain privileged power position, there will probably be some kind of a backlash to any kind of a challenge to those status quo hierarchies. So if we think about the global north and the global south, for example, then if the global south starts to seem like it's in the position to challenge that relation of dominance, then the global north could start to feel fear. But the fear is not just that this previously unilateralist and empowered actor would dominate and lose that. The fear is that they might end up being subjugated. And that fear is probably born from the fact that those actors, that's what they did when they held the power. They were quite happy to wield that power unilaterally over those that they could subjugate. And I would say there's been a lot of conversation about the Mark Carney Davos speech, where he called out that there was this face of power that we could see in the Pax Americana, and now it was naked with the new American administration. But in a way, I think here, again, we need to look at where we are in 2026 and look back that the United States has for decades been extractive and been politically interventive and militarily interventive throughout Latin America. And for some reason, the allies of the United States have chosen not to ignore that. For example, the NATO allies, it's not something that they usually draw attention to, that this unilateralism has been problematic for some of the actors since the 1950s. So with that, I want to look at unilateralism, conflict, and nuclear weapons. And I'm using this term nuclear apartheid. I didn't come up with it. Nuclear apartheid refers to the fact that only some states in the whole world system of states are recognized by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was written in 1968. Only some states are privileged and are entitled by this treaty to hold nuclear weapons. So if we look at the treaty, there are 5 nuclear weapon states: the United States, China, Russia, the United Kingdom, and France, that are recognized by the treaty and have signed the treaty. And these are the nuclear weapon states. Then there are the non-nuclear weapon states, which are 186 states. And that's everyone else minus India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. And those states have not signed. They are not a member of the NPT treaty, and they have nuclear arms. Israel's thought to, although it hasn't been admitted. And yet, if we look at what would be consistent with an international rule of laws-based system, according to Article 6 of the NPT, all nuclear weapon states are obligated to move toward arms control and eventual abolition. So, just standing back, since we are talking about what are existential and global catastrophic risks, just to call out, how do these nuclear weapon systems, where do the risks come from? They come from accidents and miscalculations, misperceptions. Maybe somebody thinks there's an incoming attack, but it wasn't actually a nuclear weapon that was headed for the country that decided to counterattack. There can be accidental, inadvertent escalation, just a bad decision, overconfidence. These weapon systems in the Russia and the United States, they're on high alert status, which means they're ready to go off in minutes. There can be command and control vulnerabilities. There can be, the United States and Russia and several of the other countries have a first use doctrine, meaning they have stated that they will use nuclear weapons before anybody else has used them. There's very significantly short time windows to make decisions, something on the order of 15 or less minutes to decide. Then now we have artificial intelligence, which can get in the loop, maybe if some defense planner incorporates it in decision loops, We don't know exactly how decisions are made. There can be the possibility of cyber attacks, geopolitical tensions, and proliferation, erosion of norms. So there's a number of ways that nuclear weapons pose existential risks for everyone on Earth. I'm just putting this slide here briefly from a nuclear deterrence point of view, but my only point here is not to go through all the depth of the slide, but just to look at why do countries seek to wield nuclear weapons, and looking at how the primary function, the tier one, the red box, tier one and everything above it, the idea is that, well, if you're deterring against the nuclear attack, or if there's a deterrence against some kind of an existential threat to a state or an ally under a nuclear umbrella, that's considered to be the main function of nuclear weapons. But it's possible to have nuclear weapons on the table for escalation dominance, to control a military outcome, for flexible responses to military events, and as a coercive bargaining tool. So keeping that in mind, on this next slide, I'm adding that when we look at this nuclear apartheid, probably many of us are aware that it isn't just those countries that are entitled to have nuclear weapons that actually have them. Through NATO nuclear sharing, we also have nuclear weapons in Belgium, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Turkey. And also it's clear now that the United Kingdom, which of course has its own nuclear trident system, that in 2025, it actually acquired, it had given up in the 1990s, but now in 1925, it reacquired nuclear weapons under this NATO nuclear sharing policy. Now, arguably, and scholars have written that legally, from an international law point of view, that UK acquirement of these nuclear weapons is a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty for the reason that it expands nuclear arsenals and it puts them where they had been taken away before. And arguably, since NATO's on a first use basis, arguably these weapons could be considered tier 2 and they're dual use, that they significantly contribute to global and existential risk at the same time that they seem to violate an international treaty. And here we have to be clear that it's not just, rogue actors, but we have to hold everybody accountable for what we would want to happen in an international law-based order. So when we think about where we are with nuclear weapons and existential risk, just recall unilateralism. It can be by a single nation or actor. It can be by a class of actors against another class of actors. For example, nuclear weapon states could be considered one class of actors, and the non-nuclear weapon states, or creditor and debtor states, for example. There's lots of different hierarchies where the hierarchy seems to be one of a unilateral control of one party over the other. Doesn't seem necessarily very reciprocal. So if we consider current geopolitical configuration, all nations are bearing the risk from those few nations that actually have the nuclear weapons. And it's hard to argue, or at least I see it hard to come to a conclusion, that it's not primarily those actors that are wielding the nuclear weapons that then are responsible for holding everybody else hostage in this reality that there's significant global catastrophic risk from these weapons. So how can this be justified or addressed? So I'm not sure how many in this audience might be familiar with the differences between the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty versus the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons. It's two different treaties. The one goes back to 1968, while the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons, or the TPNW, is very recent. It is from 2017. And if we look, this one doesn't actually have the number of signatories, but it's up to about 70, I believe, at the moment. And the point of that is not necessarily that the TPNW is superior for everyone's security concerns, but the reason it's there is because many of the states that are nuclear non-weapon states have gotten fed up with the lack of commitment of the nuclear weapon states to actually make progress toward reducing the existential risk of these nuclear weapons of mass destruction. In the corner, I have the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention dating to 1997 and 1975. And they're just to remember that there are chemical weapons of mass destruction, there are biological weapons of mass destruction, but these have been internationally prohibited by treaties. And so it's not impossible or inconceivable that that could also be done with nuclear weapons, although I know it would be a long way from now. But on the other hand, we have to ask ourselves, what are steps toward mitigating this existential risk and upholding the international rule of law? So with that, just concluding, bringing my talk to a close, how do we support multilateralism? How do we stand up to unilateral actors? I believe that the neoliberal era, which we could date from 1980 up until 2009 or so, that period had a dominant philosophy of public policy that was based on game theory and rational choice. And that theory accepted that all actors, by our nature, are inherently unilateral in how we decide. And that unilateralism has been stated by a Nobel Prize winner in economics, James M. Buchanan, making the statement that every one of us prefers to be a master over a world of slaves. So that I'm not just making up this idea from having studied the mathematics of game theory, but unpacking also the narratives or the statements people make about the meaning of this approach to public policy, that it tends to support that the default is going to be unilateral action on every party that is able to get away with it. The solution then is appropriate institutional design. And here often examples are the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, which of course, it kind of depends on which nation you are, what kind of a relationship you have with each of those international organizations. It also justifies or legitimates that coercive bargaining is going to be the way that agreements are made, and coercive bargaining means using threats of violence. The worst possible credible threat is how you reach your bargain, your agreement of how you're going to settle your terms. So I would argue, so I have the green for that way of thinking, but I'm going to turn to the red for the way of thinking that would be unilateralist, and the green for a response, that the solution requires a commitment to universal values, mutual respect, the no harm principle, stating what we believe and acting as we agreed to, and acting only by consent. That actually the recipe for supporting the institutions of multilateralism are pretty clear. And on this is my final slide, and raising this point then that mitigating existential risk will take a multilateral approach, but I'm going to advocate that this multilateralism can function on every level between individuals and small groups, all the way up to big like nations and international affairs. So this multilateralism, if we go back, it would involve this mutual respect, no harm principle, stating what we believe and acting as we agreed to. You could add in being trustworthy, only acting by consent. That if we bring that to our individual relationships, if we live by that belief system and enact it in households, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in civil society and organizations, local and state government, in corporations and institutions, and in international relations, it's going to be having those principles operating at all of those levels. And on the right, my final thought here, this is a fractile, a mathematical fractile pattern, which means that if you were able to zoom in or out, that pattern would keep repeating itself. And I'm using that as a image because I think that whatever layer of governance, even if it's just with a friend or a husband or a child, or if we're thinking about how do you set up your dynamics within a single household or community, that we need to have that multilateral commitment at every level of our relationships. And with that, I'm going to conclude and stop sharing.
Muchísimas gracias, Sonia Medae. Muy interesante reflexión. Voy a presentar ahora al doctor Seth Baum. Les quiero recordar a la gente que está aquí que tenemos traductores, equipos de traducción por si lo requieren afuera. El doctor Seth Baum es el director ejecutivo del Global Catastrophic Risk Institute en Estados Unidos. Realizó sus estudios de licenciatura en la Universidad de Chicago. Es doctor en geografía por la Universidad del Estado de Pensilvania. Es cofundador y director ejecutivo de Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, organización dedicada al análisis de amenazas que podrían afectar de manera irreversible a la civilización humana. Es investigador asociado y miembro del Consejo Asesor del Centro para el Estudio de Riesgo Existencial de la Universidad de Cambridge y editor asociado de la revista Science and Engineering Ethics. Sus investigaciones han contribuido al desarrollo de marcos conceptuales y de gobernanza orientados a la identificación, evaluación y mitigación de riesgos a gran escala. Nos da mucho gusto tenerlo. Le doy la palabra, doctor Baum.
Thank you very much. Let me go ahead and share my slides. Can I do this? Oh, let me try again. It says I cannot share the screen. So, if somebody else is sharing, they may need to stop sharing. But thank you everybody for having me present to you. My name is Seth Baum. I am the Executive Director of the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute. And in my talk today, I will be discussing the catastrophic risks from climate change and artificial intelligence. I'm still not able to share the slides, I don't think, but I will go ahead and proceed with my remarks. And if I'm, oh, that looks better. Let me go over to this. Are you able to see the slides now? Is this good? Yeah, okay, so excellent. So before I get into the details of the risks from climate change and artificial intelligence, just want to thank you all for letting me be able to present to you remotely because one, I have to stay here to take care of my child, but also because air travel is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, maybe 5% of total global emissions. But it's important to understand each year only about 10 or 15% of the world population uses an airplane, and about 1% of the world population causes over half of aviation emissions. And this global 1%, it includes, a lot of us who may travel around the world to attend conferences and colloquiums, events like this. And so I think it's very good that the colloquium has given us the opportunity to present to you all without having to get into an airplane. So thank you very much for that. Now, why study climate change and artificial intelligence catastrophic risks together? Well, a good kind of overall perspective for this is that these two risks they do have some important differences from each other, and we can actually learn quite a bit from considering the differences between these two risks. At the same time, they are in important ways fundamentally similar in their character, and they're also closely interconnected to each other. And for that reason, they are important to study together. They are also important to govern together in the policy domain. Let's start with this quote. This is a famous quote that's actually attributed to multiple different scholars, but it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And from my perspective as an expert on global catastrophic risk, as an expert on the end of the world, I certainly hope that this is not true, but I fear perhaps it may be. And we can see this quite vividly with both climate change and artificial intelligence. In the economy right now, if you look at the largest corporations as measured by market capitalization, this is total value of the company on the stock market. Most of the largest companies right now are all in the computer technology domain, and most of those companies are among the companies that are really pushing the frontier of artificial intelligence technology. In fact, pretty much all of these companies are, with the possible exception of Apple, which has been less active on AI, though they still are involved in AI technology. And then you see in blue, Saudi Aramco is, of course, a major fossil fuel company, a major oil company. If you go back 15 years ago to 2011, you can see that many of the largest companies in the world were fossil fuel companies, and you did have also some major computing companies already in 2011. And so for both climate change and AI, we are looking at risks that are, to a large extent, created by some of the largest companies in the world. And that poses governance challenges, of course. Um, and it also speaks to how important both of these domains are for the global economy. These are categories of technology, fossil fuels and computing and artificial intelligence, that show up in many places across the global economy. This is not an isolated niche. These are things that appear very widely. Additionally, it is now the case that artificial intelligence technology is itself a major source of the greenhouse gas emissions, especially through the recent development of very large data centers. This is a point of a lot of political controversy right now in the United States, in which many people across the country are not very happy with these data centers because they cause a lot of local pollution, and they also cause the price of electricity to go up in the areas around where they are built. But they also are major sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a sense in which the risk from climate change and the risk from AI they're not even different risks. They are interconnected as different facets of the overall risks that are created from burning fossil fuels and doing things like this. Now, at the same time, the two risks do have important differences, and you can see this from comparing these two graphs. The graph at the top shows the global temperature increase over time between 1950 and 2100. This graph is taken from the most recent report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And at the bottom, we have a graph from the most recent report of the International AI Safety Report, which is kind of like the IPCC, but for AI. And this shows change over time in the ability of AI systems to complete certain tasks. Specifically, it shows the trajectory of AI systems able to complete software tasks, and in the vertical axis going up, it's measured in terms of how much time it would take a human to complete that task. So going from at the bottom, 0 minutes for a human to complete it, and at the top, the amount of time for about 30 minutes for a human to complete it. And there are some important details here comparing these two graphs. First of all is the time scales. At the top, the graph goes from 1950 to 2100. That's 150 years. And at the bottom, it goes from 2020, maybe 2018, to around to 2026, so about 8 years. It's a much faster time frame, and this speaks to the fact that things within the AI space are changing very quickly relative to how things are changing in climate change. Additionally, we see on the top graph they have these 5 curves that are labeled SSP and then with different numbers. These SSP curves are projections into the future with 5 different sets of assumptions about what the future might look like in terms of the emissions of greenhouse gases and maybe some other factors. We don't have that in the bottom graph. And one reason for this is because it's actually much more difficult to project artificial intelligence into the future. For example, will the graph that we see continue to go in the same direction as it has been? This is actually a very important question. If it will continue to go up and up and up, then that could mean that AI technology will become extremely powerful and could at the same time pose major risks to the world. Alternatively, if the technology will, if the graph will not continue going up and will more plateau, become more of a flat line, then we can expect AI technology to still be impactful on the world, but more as it is now, and not as much something that might pose an extreme catastrophic risk to all of human civilization, even while it still does pose some risks. It already poses some risks, just perhaps not the same extreme catastrophic risk that we could get if the graph continues to go up. If we do have the AI technology that is advancing, continues to advance more rapidly like that, then that could potentially even affect what happens with the global temperatures shown in the top graph. These 5 scenarios from the IPCC report were not crafted to account for the possibility of an extreme radical technology change from AI or from other technologies for that matter. And so we could potentially see global temperatures either increasing substantially more than the top curve of the SSP scenarios, or even going much less temperature change than the bottom curve. And if it goes much higher, that could be because AI technology just keeps burning more and more fossil fuels as it has been. If it's cooler, it may be because, in the optimistic scenario, it could be because the AI is used to help develop solutions for climate change. That would be fantastic if it happens, though so far, maybe not so much. Or alternatively, a more pessimistic one would be if AI technology causes such an extreme catastrophe that it would destroy human civilization or even cause the extinction of the human species. Of course, in that case, we would expect greenhouse gas emissions to go down, and the temperatures could end up being even lower than what we see in the bottom curve of the IPCC graph. I would say there's also a lot more uncertainty about the bottom graph than there is for the top graph. The top graph is based on detailed climate modeling from many research groups around the world that has been carefully reviewed and synthesized by the many scientists of the IPCC. The bottom graph comes from one single research group and is also based on something that is more difficult to measure. How long humans take at specific software tasks? Well, which tasks, which humans? How is the experiment conducted? And so we don't have as much confidence about the curve in the second graph as we do in the first, as we do in the IPCC graph. Additionally, it just shows one set of tasks, these software tasks. What the International AI Safety Report documents is that progress over the last few years in AI technology has been, in their words, they use the word jagged. It has been much more rapid in some domains and less rapid in other domains. Software is one domain where the advancements have been more rapid, and an examples of domains in which it's been less rapid would be anything involving physical activity, so robotics, but then also things involving more qualitative analysis. Uh, and so this graph here paints a perhaps misleading picture of the progress in AI technology over the last few years, whereas the top graph on global surface temperature, of course, there is more to climate change than global surface temperature. There are differences in the temperature changes in different regions around the world. There's also important detail about extreme weather events and various other things. This is not the entire story, but it still does provide a good broad overview of what is happening with climate change. Um, and this it becomes a big challenge for AI because, excuse me, with this limitation of being able to study what's happening with AI, it makes it harder to project what will happen into the future. And there's one other detail that I should mention about projecting what may happen with AI in the future, which is on the financial side of things. A lot of the progress that has been made in AI technology over the last few years has come from increasing the scale of the AI systems. This includes increasing the scales of the amount of computing power in larger and larger data centers, so much that it becomes a major source of energy consumption and of greenhouse gas emissions. All of this results in larger costs. Burning all of that energy and building all of that computing power, that comes at a financial cost. And if we are to continue going up and up, and as this curve shows, then the financial costs become very extreme. And there are, I think, very serious questions about whether it will be cost prohibitive, whether it would be simply too expensive to continue building AI systems at larger and larger scales, especially because the AI companies already have questions about how profitable this is. There are questions in the financial sector about, is this all a big market bubble in which these companies are not actually reliably making profits, given how expensive these systems are to build and to operate. And of course, if there is a market bubble and that crashes, then this curve could flatten out or potentially even start to fall back back toward the bottom if we now are left with AI systems that are less capable because they're no longer being propped up by all this investment money that has been so far mostly operating at a loss. And so there is that as an additional point of uncertainty, that yes, there is uncertainty, similar uncertainty with respect to climate change in the top graph, but what happens with greenhouse gas emissions? This is based heavily on our energy infrastructure and a few other things that just don't move as quickly as what we've been having with AI. You wouldn't speak of like a fossil fuel industry market bubble in the same way that you could with an AI market bubble. It doesn't have the same scaling issues and things like that. The trends in energy consumption move quite slowly over time, which is unfortunate if you're trying to rapidly phase out fossil fuels to address climate change risk, but it does make the projections into the future more reliable. Okay, I want to skip over that graph and talk about the specifics of how this could pose catastrophic risks to human civilization. Because what we saw in the top graph, that relates to how much greenhouse gas emissions we put into the atmosphere and how sensitive the climate is to those emissions. There is some uncertainty in that, but overall they are, I would say, less uncertain, more certain than the part at the bottom, which is what does this mean to human civilization? And the four big things that I would point to that have been discussed in the research literature on how you could get from climate changes to an extreme catastrophe for human civilization. One is famine, especially if climate change would create a prolonged drought and heat wave. Already we have seen some examples of this, but not something that has resulted yet in an extreme global famine. Potentially, that is something that could happen in future years, especially if temperatures continue to get much warmer. Um, Extreme weather events that disrupt different parts of civilization around the world, violent conflict, potentially even including nuclear war. And then finally, infectious disease. This can happen as climate change shifts where different species will live, especially shifting them further away from the equator, so further north in the northern hemisphere. And this can bring new species into contact with human populations. We've already seen some of this to a limited extent. For example, certain infectious diseases showing up in more northern, more high latitude areas where they didn't previously exist. But it could also lead to new diseases spilling over into the human population, which could potentially even result in pandemics. Now, how much of this will actually happen, and could this lead to even the collapse of global human civilization? And if so, how much warming would need to happen for that to take place? All of that there is much more uncertainty about compared to questions of how much greenhouse gas we will emit and how sensitive the climate is to those emissions. Now, looking at the same thing for artificial intelligence, there is high uncertainty across the board. Shown here are 7 different factors that artificial intelligence systems may need to have in order to cause certain types of extreme catastrophes, especially scenarios involving loss of control, in which the AI systems effectively take over the world and human civilization loses the capacity to affect substantially what the AI systems do, in which case we may be fundamentally at the mercy of what the AI systems end up doing. And that could, depending on the details of what the AI systems end up trying to do, could lead to extreme catastrophe, potentially even the extinction of the human species. But these 7 factors here, there is a tremendous uncertainty across the board. First of all, we don't even know if these 7 factors are, in fact, the correct factors that would need to be present in order to cause a catastrophe of this sort. Second, we don't know how much the AI systems would need across each of these 7 factors, how advanced they would need to be for each of them. And we also don't know really how far along in the dangerous directions AI systems currently are, or how much they project to go across these 7 factors. We can say some about some of them. For example, the AI that we have right now, especially the generative AI, the large language models, are capable of being used for some amount of social manipulation in which they will interact with people in ways that will alter how people think about things. But it's maybe still only limited in that regard, as one example of this. And so I think clearly right now we are not at a point in which the AI technology that we have is past a dangerous threshold across all 7 of these factors. And I personally have my doubts about whether the current paradigm with the large language models and the generative AI will get there. I am more skeptical than some of my colleagues are on that. But as you start to look further into the future, what will things look like 10 years from now, 20 years from now? It becomes extremely difficult to make any sort of projections of what that looks like. And so that causes major challenges for us for the governance of these technologies. There is one other very interesting difference between the AI and the climate change risks. At the top is a headline from the Los Angeles Times newspaper talking about how ExxonMobil, the major oil company, has been denying the reality, the science of global warming for many years, even though they quietly predicted it. The story there is that ExxonMobil had internal to the company a team of scientists that was studying global warming and was actually doing some very good research. This was in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. ExxonMobil was actually at the forefront of climate science for that brief stretch of time, but publicly they denied it because they wanted to downplay the risk for the benefit of their corporate interests. In contrast, the headline at the bottom from CNN shows that it talks about how AI companies will often publicly talk about the risks that their technology will have the potential to cause. This idea of a white-collar bloodbath, this is the possibility of very high unemployment among white-collar workers, people who have office jobs, computer-based jobs, things of that sort. So far, there has been some shift in the jobs, but not the white-collar bloodbath that is talking about here. But this is a line from the AI industry. I think the explanation for this is that whereas climate change is an inadvertent byproduct of burning fossil fuels, AI risk is a direct consequence of building advanced AI. So it is for climate change, it is an inadvertent byproduct because when the oil companies, the fossil fuel companies, they sell their fossil fuels, they burn it for the purpose of energy consumption. Climate change is this other thing that happens off to the side, off in the atmosphere. It's not directly connected to the product itself, which is about energy. In contrast, the risk from AI comes from having advanced AI systems, and those advanced AI systems, that's the product. And so the two things are closely connected. And what that means for the fossil fuel industry is that they have a reason to downplay the risk to instead focus on the value to society from the energy consumption from their core product of selling fossil fuels. Whereas with the AI industry, they have the incentive to promote how advanced their technology is, how advanced their technology could become in the near future. And yes, that may also pose some risks, but that just speaks to how important their work is, how important their technology is, which is an important message for them to give to the investors and the customers that are at the core of their business activity. This doesn't mean that they are wrong necessarily when they hype up the threat, but it does give us a reason to be skeptical of that in the same way that we should be skeptical of the fossil fuel industry trying to say that climate change is not a risk. And so in closing, I'll just briefly mention a few policy implications. First of all, we need more aggressive risk reduction for both AI and climate change, along with other catastrophic risks. Second, we need to monitor for movement toward catastrophe. So this is monitoring greenhouse gas emissions, yes, but especially monitoring conditions in terms of famine and extreme weather and all of that stuff to try to make sure that civilization stays resilient. And then for AI monitoring, especially across those 7 risk factors and potentially any other risk factors, to see if AI technology is moving in a dangerous direction. But above all, what we need is more robust corporate governance. The bottom line with both of these risks is that increasing the risk of catastrophe can be profitable, including for some of the largest corporations in the world. And so we need for those corporations to be governed in ways that balance the risks to the entire world against their profit motives that these companies have. Right now, I would say we are not doing an adequate job of this, and some of this is a legacy of the neoliberal ideology that we heard in the previous talk. We need to do much better on this, both the companies through their internal corporate governance, but also us as broader society, public policy, all of that needs to be more robust. And just one specific example is restricting data centers. As I mentioned, this is a major policy issue in the United States. Restricting data centers has the advantage of simultaneously decreasing both AI risk and energy consumption that drives climate change, which makes it a good specific idea that can help for policy on both risks. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, doctor Baum. Una conexión que no se habla mucho y que sin duda nos da mucho que pensar. Me gustaría darle la palabra ahora al doctor Dibble Spiegelhalter. Él es expresidente fundador del Winton Center for Risk and Evidence Communication en Inglaterra. Realizó sus estudios iniciales en matemáticas y el doctorado en estadística por la Universidad de Cambridge. Ha presidido el Winton Center for Risk and Evidence Communication, así como el Royal Statistics Society. Ha participado en el programa Desert Island Discs y ha presentado dos importantes documentales: Tales You Win, The Science of Chance y galardonado Climate Change by Numbers. Ha contribuido de manera significativa al desarrollo de metodologías para el análisis de riesgos complejos en ámbitos como la salud pública, la tecnología y las políticas públicas. Es autor de los libros The Art of Statistics y COVID by Numbers. Adelante, muchas gracias, doctor Spiegelhalter.
Thank you very much indeed. Have I unmuted myself? Yes. Thank you very much indeed. It's a huge pleasure to talk at this meeting. Now, I should say that I try to keep away from existential risks and global catastrophic risks. I think it's not really my area. So I have learnt so much from the previous two talks, and I think I may have something relevant to say. I hope so. Anyway, let me see that. Can you see that okay? Thumbs up. Seth, can you see that? Is that right? Cool. Great. Thank you very much. So that's me. I'm Emeritus Professor of Statistics at Cambridge University. I got a, self-advertisement, my new book, Art of Uncertainty. I'm going to be talking about some of the ideas in this, which I go into in more detail in the book. But I'm going to start with an example of another, what you might call precipitous military action by the US. This was the Bay of Pigs invasion after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and the CIA, without telling the army or anybody, they planned an invasion by 1,500 Cuban exiles. And when President Kennedy was inaugurated in 1961, that's when he found out about it, and he commissioned a report by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they did not think this was a good idea. And amongst themselves, they thought the chance of success was about 30% and a 70% chance of failure. But in the final report that went to Kennedy, the numbers were replaced by the phrase, a fair chance of success. Now, they meant not very good, and they really regretted afterwards not putting the numbers in. I'm not sure how that translates into Spanish, but if I heard that something had a fair chance, I would think, well, that's quite a good, quite likely to happen. Anyway, Kennedy approved the invasion and it was a complete fiasco. There's Castro himself jumping off a tank at the Bay of Pigs. And since then, the intelligence community have learned that using words like could, perhaps, and so on, can be very dangerous indeed. The words are very easily misunderstood when we're communicating uncertainty. And I'm a statistician, and so my first point is that when we're talking about well-defined events, we'll get on to the more difficult to define things later. But when we're talking about well-defined events, we should try to use numbers. So, for example, if you're in the UK intelligence services, MI5 or MI6, and you use the word likely, you must mean between 55 and 75% probability. And I know that because actually I've got it here as well. I gave a talk at MI5, the UK Domestic Intelligence Service, and I got this mug. And the mug says that, for example, the mug says that if the mug is 30% empty, I am unlikely to need a refill. So if an analyst thinks there's a 30% chance of success, they must use the word unlikely to succeed. And I think that would have been very valuable in 1961. So 30% has to be described as unlikely. And later on, we'll see another correspondence between words and numbers for well-defined events. So that's my first lesson, avoid words. Now, I've taught the theory of decision-making in the face of uncertainty. For years, I learned it and taught it. And if we look at that theory, and we've heard about game theory already, in those situations, you have to consider all options and all possible futures with their values, probabilities of all possible futures, and you're supposed to look at the expected value and choose the option that maximizes the expected utility or value. This is the theory for rational decision making. But in any realistic complex situation, this is just not feasible. It's not going to happen. You cannot do all of those things with any kind of precision. You might try, but it's actually, we should realize that in the real world, this is not feasible. The real world is more complicated than what we learn in our lectures. And in my book, I use this diagram, which I took from a colleague, Andy Sterling, which sort of breaks up the circumstances we might be in. And if we look along the top, we might be, if we're on the left, and it's a continuum, it's not just either or, it's a continuum from very well-defined outcomes, like the success of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which I think is fairly well-defined, or average climate change, temperature change by 2050, for example. And then on the right, as we move to the right, we get to the fact that, like Seth was describing about the possible harms of AI, well, we can't even think about them a lot of the time. As he said, we could think of some, but there's others that he can't even think of. Looking downwards, we might be very happy about providing probabilities. We might have a good model, standard risk analysis using lots of data. But then as we get we've got very little data, we're left with maybe subjective judgments like the Bay of Pigs, or much more or much vaguer way of putting numbers on our events. They may be very rough. So down in area B, for example, the UK has a national risk register in which it looks at, like many risk registers, it looks at impact on a scale from 1 to 5, from minor to catastrophic, and likelihood over the next 2 or 5 years. And that, again, very broad categories are used for that. And there's about 60 risks, or more than 63 risks or so. There's just some of them up on the left, and it goes from aviation, collision, cyber attacks, terrorist attacks, rail accidents, and so on. So we could just look at one of them, assassination of a major figure, and that's put down here, that's number 6. and more than 25% chance that's going to happen, in fact, in the near future, but it's considered of limited impact. Actually, assassinating a major figure is going to have limited impact. Perhaps President Trump should have thought of that, or the Israelis, before they take out the Iranian leadership. So I think that these exercises, I think, are valuable. They get things wrong. The 2010 risk register in the UK did not have volcanic eruptions in it. Why should they for England? But of course, the Icelandic volcano in 2010 closed European airspace for 10 days and caused complete chaos. Similarly, pandemic risk from flu is always high, but from an emerging infection such as COVID was not considered a big risk in 2020. We've already seen, Seth put up a graph very similar to this of air temperature change under the very different scenarios for, and we see there considerable uncertainty. As Seth, emphasized, even this does not express probably the full uncertainty, although they make the intervals very wide. They really try to build in as much uncertainty as possible from the variation between alternative models. And I think that's quite a good communication of uncertainty. IPCC, I think also they've got their own scale for turning words into numbers. For them, likely means above 66%. So unlikely for them means between 0 and 33%. Actually, it's between 10 and 33% because very unlikely comes in at 10%. So again, Bay of Pigs would have to be described as unlikely. But they also, and I think this is a very good thing, for areas where they're not even happy about putting probabilities, they also give an estimate of their confidence in the claims being made, even if they're not putting probabilities, which depend on the type of evidence, the amount and the quality and the consistency of opinion. So, for example, when they're happy to put probabilities, they'll say the likely range of total human-caused global temperature is between 0.8 degrees and 1.3 degrees. But when they just make a judgment that atmospheric CO2 was higher than at any time in at least, so many million years, they just say that with a claim with high confidence, meaning that there's good evidence and good agreement. And this idea of having confidence levels is used in UK policy decisions, have low, medium and high confidence in the analysis underlying policy decisions. And I think this is a very good way of communicating, in a way, the quality of the underlying evidence. Now, the bottom corner, area C. This is where I like the term deep uncertainty, where we can't even list the possibilities, let alone put good probabilities on them. And Seth's analysis of the risks of AI, I think, did that very nicely. He's got a list, but he admits that is incomplete. We're now in the area of Donald Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns, where we can't even think of what we don't know. And I argue very strongly in the book that in these situations, which I think are increasingly common in our world, we need two characteristics. We need humility to admit we don't know, and imagination to try to think of what might happen. In other words, to try to turn the unknown unknowns into known unknowns. This requires a particular skill that I haven't got, which is really to think of, in a way, all the bad things that could happen, maybe even the good things that can happen, but to really use imagination about the future. Then, of course, when it comes to decision making, we cannot optimize, we cannot use decision theory. We have to make decisions that are resilient not just robust, but resilient to things we may not even have thought of. That's always means there's going to be redundancy. That always will mean these are expensive than so-called optimized decisions. But that's what we need. So what's the connection between a magician and Donald Trump? Now, when I've asked this before, somebody said misdirection, which I thought was really clever, actually, so you're not looking at what actually is important. I thought that, but that's not my idea. With both, we should expect surprises. When we see a magician, we know something's going to happen that we didn't expect. Whoa, we know there's going to be a surprise. Trump, we've got to expect surprises. We go, that the erratic, the lack of predictability is just part of it. So this is just, I think, part of our approach that we have to have in an age of uncertainty that we have. So how do we try to deal with this idea of that we can't even imagine the future? Well, there are two basic approaches. One is to look at where we are now and think forward. What could happen? It's sometimes called intuitive logics. So you say, well, this could happen, and this could happen, and this could happen. And then but you also need imagination to think of these potential surprises. Now, the Ministry of Defence, the UK, they employ science fiction writers. I think that's brilliant. To think of surprising futures. They're very good stories. There's a very good one there about a drone attack on London, written, a few years ago, that is, now increasingly realistic. So this is again the idea of trying to use our imagination just to think of those possible futures. Because if somebody does come up with a possible future, you can then think backwards. How could these come about? How could we prevent them happening? It's exactly the reasoning that Seth was talking about earlier, about what steps could we put, what possible mitigations could we put in place to try to prevent these things happening. But we need the imagination to think about them. This corner up here, you think, well, that seems odd. We can't think of what might happen, and yet we can put probabilities on it. What? But the people who do that are the Bank of England. The Bank of England produce what are called fan charts, which this is, for example, looking at growth. This is from 2023, in which they have three bands, a 30%, 60%, and 90% predictions. But the final 10% is not assigned. It's somewhere else. They're not going to say where it could be. So they put a probability on none of the above, something we didn't expect. Again, I think this is really clever. And if we look back to 2020, look, there's a 25% reduction in GDP. That's exactly the sort of surprising event, unpredicted event, that they are warning banks and other people to be resilient to. Essentially, bets are off. There's a 10% chance. Well, the 5% chance there's going to be a drop of unknown size. I think it's a really neat idea. Now, I often get asked about trust. How can we get people to trust scientists, trust experts, to listen to us? And I reply, that's the wrong question. It's the wrong question. And I'm influenced by a philosopher, because this is a philosophy department. We're talking in a philosopher of Kant, Professor Honora O'Neill, who uses ideas of duty ethics to argue that organizations should not be aiming to increase trust in them. Instead, they should aim to demonstrate trustworthiness. This has been the most important idea in the last 10 years of my life. I use it all the time in my personal life and in all the work and in every talk I give. The fact that authorities should not expect to be trusted. They need to earn that trust by demonstrating trustworthiness. They have a duty to do that. And I'm on the board of the UK Statistics Authority, that runs the official statistics system for the UK, and there is a code of practice for statistics. And the number one pillar of the code of practice is trustworthiness. And that is a direct influence of a philosopher of Kant. Isn't that wonderful? She's had a direct influence on the official statistics system in the UK. That trustworthiness is the number one priority to demonstrate it. So when we want to communicate risk and uncertainty, I would say there's no correct way to do this. No, there's no simple formula at all. You need to know your audiences. You need to decide what is important for each audience to understand. Try different methods and see which works best. You need multiple layers. Just a gist level. Maybe you can only give a very qualitative level. Sometimes you might have basic quantities. You can use words and numbers and graphics because people prefer some of those, although I think words should try to have a numerical interpretation. But the main factor is trustworthiness. And we wrote some guidance for trustworthy communication, which I think this was during COVID in 2020. And I still really believe that we got that these are good. The first is that, and this is how you also should judge communications from authorities who are telling you about things. These is what the questions you should ask. Are they trying to inform me or persuade me? And they should be trying to inform me, to empower me, to make better decisions, to understand things better. Are they being balanced? Or are they selecting evidence? Are they being upfront about uncertainty and acknowledging uncertainty? Are they being clear how good the evidence is? Maybe it's not very good at all. And number 5, I think, is important, is that are they trying to preempt misunderstandings? Are they telling me what the evidence does not mean? Which in an age of misinformation is incredibly important to say, we are not completely confident, but we do know this does not mean X, known as pre-bunking misinformation. Okay, just to finish off, I'd like to just give another inspiring person in my life was John Krebs, who was head of the Food Standards Agency in the UK. When we had disaster after disaster, we had mad cow disease, we had foot and mouth disease, chaos in our food system. He had to deal with all these crises. And he had a way of communicating to the public in a crisis. And his 5 points he used were, first of all, to say what we know. Yep, we are confident about this. And then immediately to say what we don't know. To be upfront, to be clear about the uncertainty. Then to say what we are doing to find out, the research we're doing, the extra investigations and so on. To tell people what people can do in the meantime, to be on the safe side, so there is some self-efficacy. But the final point is the most important one. The advice will change. As we learn more, we will change what we think, what we believe, and our advice will change. Now, the problem is that politicians find it impossible to use step 5. They can never admit the provisionality of what they're saying. So in COVID in the UK, the politicians started about the importance of hand washing and wiping, cleaning surfaces. We knew within a few weeks that this was of very little importance. It was much more important to do with fresh air, and because it was airborne, not droplets. But the advice didn't change, not for a year, because they couldn't change their minds. They were stuck. They couldn't change their minds. So this is my other, as I said, it's the philosopher, and this person's a zoologist. These are the people who have really taught me a lot about these difficult topics. So to finish off, I think handling uncertainty requires both formal analysis and always judgment. If you've got well-defined outcomes, rough numbers are better than no numbers. But you need to engage multiple perspectives. You want multiple opinions from people. You deliberately need to seek out people who might disagree with you. You've got to expect surprises. Just think of the magician and Donald Trump. You need imagination to explore possible futures. And trustworthy communication of uncertainty is just vital to everybody. It's the absolutely fundamental need in this difficult area. So thank you very much. I shall stop then. And I'd like to also just thank the other two speakers because I learned so much from them. This is not my area at all. So thank you very much indeed.
Muchas gracias, doctor Spiegelhalter. Para no ser su área, nos ha dejado mucho que considerar. Ahora para los primeros comentarios me gustaría darle pues la palabra a la arquitecta Miriam Ursúa. Ella es secretaria actual de Gestión Integral de Riesgo y Protección Civil de la Ciudad de México. Es una destacada arquitecta mexicana con especialización en hospitales, cuenta con estudios de posgrado en investigación y docencia del urbanismo por la UNAM y estudios de posgrado también en la Universidad de Chile. Ha cursado un diplomado en Ciencias Políticas y Sociales en Alemania. Sus líneas de investigación y especialización se centran en el urbanismo, la gestión del riesgo de desastre, la resiliencia urbana, la mitigación de vulnerabilidades ante fenómenos naturales y antrópicos, la planeación territorial sostenible y la transversalización de la protección civil en políticas públicas urbanas y ambientales. Y recientemente, esta semana, nos da muchísimo gusto felicitarla porque recibió la Medalla al Mérito de Protección Civil. Sin duda es una persona que nos cuida día y noche y le agradezco enormemente. Sí, porque sé la complejidad del trabajo que tienes. Me da mucho gusto que nos puedas acompañar.
Muchísimas gracias. Primero, muchísimas gracias por la invitación a escuchar tan importantes y yo creo que interesantes participaciones que nos han mostrado el tema de los riesgos, tanto como riesgos globales, los riesgos sistémicos, los riesgos catastróficos, los riesgos existenciales, de una forma distinta, ¿sí? Y asumiendo además también temas distintos, que yo creo que son lo más importante. En el caso de nuestra doctora Sonja, yo quisiera simplemente decir que el Global Catastrophic Risk Report de 2026 abre con una sentencia directa, que es: la humanidad no está completamente preparada. La doctora nos ayuda a entender por qué no es cuestión de datos ni es cuestión tampoco también de tecnología, sino que de arquitecturas institucionales, ¿ya?, que producen una inacción colectiva incluso cuando el conocimiento existe. Desde la gestión de riesgo de una ciudad como la nuestra, esto resuena con fuerza, por supuesto. Hemos construido sistemas de alertas, hemos construido protocolos de respuesta para los distintos fenómenos perturbadores de nuestra ciudad. Hemos desarrollado capacidades operativas, pero cuando el riesgo es sistémico, cuando las causas están fuera de nuestra jurisdicción, cuando las consecuencias y las consecuencias también dentro de ellas, la pregunta de gobernanza se vuelve política y se vuelve ética. ¿Cuánto puede hacer una ciudad sola frente a los riesgos que ningún Estado-nación ha podido gobernar todavía? El llamado de la doctora Sonja a reconstruir realidades compartidas y marcos de coordinación no es una aspiración filosófica, es una condición de posibilidad para la acción pública. Yo quisiera simplemente decir también, en este caso, que a mí me pareció sumamente interesante esta relación de unilateralismo y multilateralismo. Es decir, ¿cuál es la diferencia entre una y otra? ¿Qué tanto es positivo el multilateralismo para la gobernanza y qué tan desastroso realmente se está convirtiendo el unilateralismo, que lo estamos observando día a día, especialmente con nuestro vecino incómodo? Yo quisiera también decir con respecto al doctor Seth, ¿ya? El Global Risk Report 2026 también ilustra algo que el doctor ha denominado con precisión, y esto tiene que ver con la paradoja del cortoplacismo institucional. Los mismos líderes que identifican los riesgos climáticos y tecnológicos como los más severos a largo plazo, los postergan frente a urgencias geopolíticas y económicas inmediatas. El concepto de statu quo captura algo que quienes trabajamos en gestión de riesgo conocemos bien. La inacción también es una decisión, puede ser la más costosa. Desde la Ciudad de México esto se traduce en una pregunta concreta. ¿Cómo integramos en nuestros atlas, cómo integramos en nuestros protocolos y en nuestros presupuestos los riesgos que pueden tardar años en materializarse, pero cuyas consecuencias pueden ser también irreversibles? El llamado del doctor Baum a institucionalizar esta evaluación no como un ejercicio académico, sino como una práctica de gobierno ordinario, es desde nuestra experiencia un imperativo institucional en donde los gobiernos locales también deben hacer lo propio. Y finalmente, el doctor Spiegelhalter, la investigación de la Nutfield Foundation, publicada en 2025, confirmó que doctor realmente ha defendido durante décadas comunicar la incertidumbre con honestidad no reduce la confianza pública, la fortalece. Y yo les podría dar algunos ejemplos, además de lo que ha sido esto en la propia Ciudad de México. Cuando nosotros hemos tenido desastres, cuando nosotros hemos tenido incidentes graves, lo principal ha sido la comunicación. Y esta comunicación debe ser lo más verdadera posible, lo más cercana a la realidad posible. Y dar cada ciertos momentos, cada cierto tiempo, mayor información que le permita a la ciudadanía entender qué fue lo que pasó, cómo pasó y quiénes están participando en la solución de los problemas y de qué manera vamos a solucionar esta situación que se nos ha provocado en la ciudad. Es simplemente un entre paréntesis que quisiera hacer. En protección civil, nosotros sabemos que el mayor riesgo operativo no es la emergencia en sí, sino que la pérdida de credibilidad ante la ciudadanía. Esa pérdida de credibilidad nosotros la hemos estado rescatando durante todos estos años, justamente con una comunicación de riesgo en donde hemos preparado compañeros para justamente trabajar en ese sentido y enfrentarnos a la ciudadanía, te digo, en forma transparente, pero sobre todo que sea una información confiable. Una alerta que no se activa cuando debería, o que se activa sin precisión, erosiona, por supuesto, la confianza que hace posible la acción colectiva en momentos críticos. Les pongo un ejemplo. Es decir, si nos suena la alerta sísmica y no pasa nada, perdemos la confianza de la ciudadanía. Eso quiere decir que las herramientas que tenemos no están funcionando adecuadamente. Es por eso que estamos haciendo un esfuerzo enorme dentro de la ciudad para que esa información, te digo, sea cada vez más certera. Yo creo que las enseñanzas del doctor Spiegelhalter es especialmente valiosa para el debate de hoy. En tiempos de incertidumbre radical, la pregunta no es cómo parecer seguros, sino cómo es parecer dignos de la confianza. Esa distinción debería guiar la comunicación de riesgo a todos los niveles de gobierno. Hasta aquí.
Muchas gracias. Pues por favor, un muy fuerte aplauso. Conforme íbamos avanzando, yo soy la segunda comentarista, entonces me da muchísimo gusto tener la oportunidad de compartir algunas de las reflexiones que hemos pues, tomado nota mientras ustedes presentaban, porque sin duda tocaron temas que son pues muy importantes. El riesgo existencial diferente al riesgo global catastrófico, como estos eventos que pues ponen en riesgo la existencia de la humanidad. Puede parecer en algunas ocasiones que nos pueden, digamos, como inmovilizar, nos pueden neutralizar en términos de si va a pasar y, digamos, no hay manera, ¿para qué actuar? ¿O para qué prevenir? ¿Para qué hacer algo al respecto? Y vinculado, por ejemplo, con pues riesgos nucleares, que fue el ejemplo que la doctora Amadei nos puso como sugerencia, y el riesgo climático que nos manejó el doctor Baum, pues creo que nos ayuda a entender que hay mucho que tener en mente a la hora de hacer este análisis, porque además la escala importa. Importa en términos de cómo nos aproximamos a cada uno de estos problemas y también en el campo de actuación que tenemos habilitado, ¿no? Para hacer frente a estos casos. Hace la pregunta, o sea, nos va poniendo algunos escenarios de preocupación, por ejemplo, el éxodo de Estados Unidos del Acuerdo de París, pero nos da también pues, la noticia alegre de que hay esfuerzos que se hacen de manera unilateral, como el que se maneja en Brasil con el Tropical Forest Forever Facility, que nos dan alternativas para hacer frente a estos crisis. Y justamente esta idea de la unilateralidad versus la multilateralidad tiene un juego temporal importante. Particularmente creo que el hecho de que el proceso multilateral es algo que vemos en clase seguido, lleva mucho tiempo alcanzar consensos, lleva mucho tiempo, digamos, ponerse de acuerdo, pero las decisiones son mucho más sólidas y el compromiso es mucho más certero, hace que en ocasiones se opte por ver estas alternativas unilaterales. Creo que sí, la solución requiere tener el principio precautorio y tener estos valores universales que sin duda se conjunta un poco con lo que vimos ayer. Ayer tuvimos una presentación de un libro en la que se desata una conversación magistral donde la doctora Camps nos habla un poquito de la confianza. Y este es un término que regresa luego también en la presentación del doctor Spiegelhalter para mencionarnos que es importante tener en mente que no es gratuita la confianza. La confianza pues viene, digamos, de la mano de la confiabilidad. Y esa confiabilidad es la que se puede gestionar y la que se puede manejar, como lo han hecho muy bien, a mi parecer, y es algo que me gustaría reconocer. Tenemos, por ejemplo, el día de hoy una alerta para una onda de calor que empieza a partir de mañana y va a estar afectando la Ciudad de México por los próximos 5 días. Y nos los avisan con tiempo para que estemos prevenidos, y son este tipo de alertas los que nos ayudan a tener pues, hasta cierto punto una mejor respuesta ante situaciones que nos pueden poner en riesgo. En cuanto a la combinación que hace el doctor Baum entre cambio climático e inteligencia artificial, creo que es muy interesante pensar en cómo están interconectadas, porque sí, lo menciona muy claramente, las trayectorias que se determinaron para los diferentes escenarios climáticos no tenían idea de lo que pasaría unos años después, con la introducción y el crecimiento prácticamente exponencial de la inteligencia artificial. Y su vinculación, por ejemplo, con el sector financiero y el consumo energético, hacen que sean elementos que se tienen que considerar de manera integrada, de manera conjunta, porque si no, el riesgo incrementa, el riesgo de digamos, de no asociar factores que contribuyen, pues hace que sea mucho más complicada la gestión y por lo tanto la gobernanza. ¿Cómo se determina ese umbral de peligro ante el crecimiento de la inteligencia artificial? Eso me gustaría ver qué piensa el doctor Baum al respecto, porque creo que es verdaderamente complicado. No es una... Nos menciona, por ejemplo, que se requieren cambios en la política importantes. Por ejemplo, tratar de que haya una gobernanza corporativa robusta. Y para ello, pues, creo que esos beneficios que pueden tener de la crisis muchas empresas son difíciles de estimar y de calcular. Bien nos decía el doctor David que muchas ocasiones son las propias empresas las que van investigando, ¿no?, sobre situaciones con las que se vinculan, de las que se pueden beneficiar, y esa información no siempre se defiende, ¿no? En ese sentido, restringir, por ejemplo, el crecimiento de estos centros de datos que sostienen y dan base, algo que mencionamos con frecuencia, pero no sé qué tanto interiorizamos, es que el uso de la inteligencia artificial en muchas ocasiones pues tiene una huella ambiental muy fuerte y esa huella no la vemos, no la reconocemos, no sabemos de dónde proviene la energía que facilita estos procesos que nos hacen la vida más rápida y más sencilla, sí, pero tenemos que considerar con responsabilidad, porque el riesgo lo vamos incrementando conforme tratemos de dejar fuera algunos aspectos. Y luego el arte de la incertidumbre y toda la presentación inicial sobre la Bahía de los Cerdos y el uso del lenguaje como un elemento de confianza para la comunicación del riesgo, creo que es muy acertado y además muy importante de reconocer. No hay nada, yo a veces he recomendado a mis alumnos que para una noche de insomnio lean un reporte del IPCC, porque son verdaderamente complicados de leer. Los rangos de probabilidad y de incertidumbre hacen que sean verdaderamente pesados, ¿no? Es una lectura compleja y tiene una razón de ser. Es la base de la toma de decisiones y por lo tanto, pues los países tienen que tener, ahora sí una expresión muy mexicana, pero todos los pelos de la burra en la mano para poder tomar decisiones adecuadas. Y justo el ejemplo que nos pone el doctor Spiegelhalter al principio de la decisión que tomó Kennedy por un problema de idioma, nos hace reflexionar un poco sobre cómo hablamos de riesgos y cómo pues vamos pues fortaleciendo la capacidad de comunicar y fortalecer nuestra reacción. Y me gustan mucho los dos elementos que pues tenemos que tener en cuenta para reconocer lo que no sabemos, ¿no? La humildad y la imaginación. Creo que son dos elementos clave que muchas veces fallan en la política pública porque es una cuestión casi como de ego pero cuando se incluyen, cuando se reconoce que no sabemos con humildad y buscamos con imaginación salidas a estos desconocidos, pues tenemos mejores posibilidades de enfrentarnos desde eso que mencionamos, esa lógica intuitiva, esa imaginación, considerando ese elemento sorpresa, que sin duda esa comparativa que nos muestra nos hace reflexionar mucho en cómo se gestiona. Y bueno, pues llevarlo hacia la confiabilidad, es decir, informar, no persuadir. Creo que eso es un elemento que es clave. Las personas tienen que hacerse propietarias de su propio riesgo, tienen que gestionar su propio riesgo, y en esta distribución digamos, de la responsabilidad de autocuidado y de autoprotección, en donde siento que la Secretaría de Gestión Integral de Riesgo lo ha hecho muy bien mediante capacitaciones, mediante el brigadeo, mediante el fortalecimiento de la participación comunitaria, pues necesitamos que le demos lugar a la incertidumbre. Ya esta incertidumbre en forma de lo que podría suceder, que no sabemos qué puede suceder. Ese gráfico del Banco de Inglaterra, en donde le dan un 10% a una eventualidad externa que no se puede factorizar dentro de los procesos, nos hace pensar que tendríamos que tenerlo así en cualquier situación. Y luego ahora recientemente con el comentario de Miriam, ¿cuánto podemos hacer desde una ciudad cuando las escalas tienen le añaden complejidad a la toma de decisiones, le añaden pues muchas capas de incertidumbre, de dificultad? Una gestión adecuada del riesgo requiere esta interacción multiescalar que muchas veces es muy difícil de lograr. Entonces, creo que sí, esta inacción, esta decisión a no actuar por miedo a enfrentar esta complejidad, no es admisible, no es una posibilidad cuando estamos hablando con personas que están en otras partes del mundo y tenemos perfecta coincidencia en las temáticas que abordamos. Creo que me gustaría dejar hasta aquí mi comentario para dar lugar a una sesión de preguntas y tengo ya algunas por redes que me gustaría ir leyendo, pero me gustaría invitarles a los estudiantes, a los profesores que están aquí con nosotros, a hacer preguntas, aprovechar el altísimo nivel de las personas que tenemos hoy con nosotros para que puedan ir contestándonos de la manera posible, ¿no? No sé si hay alguien por aquí o empezamos con el público que nos ve por redes. Anímense y mientras voy leyendo algunas preguntas que tenemos por aquí. Angélica Esparza nos pregunta, en la gestión de energía nuclear y sus usos, ¿qué normativa vigente existe en materia de eliminación de residuos derivados de su generación y fabricación en aparatos médicos? Voy a hacer un par de preguntas más para que podamos tener una respuesta más concreta. ¿Dónde podemos encontrar estudios sobre las consecuencias biológicas del uso excesivo de la tecnología en los seres vivos? Esta no sé quién la quiera tomar, pero es interesante. ¿Existen instrumentos para medir el desperdicio de energía per cápita en el uso de la inteligencia artificial por plataforma y hardware? Si les parece, en lo que las personas que están aquí con nosotros se animan, podemos ir abordando estas preguntas. No sé quién se anime a empezar. Adelante, doctora Madej.
Hi. Yeah, I could just take on the nuclear. So nuclear energy management is a really important question. And as you're probably aware, it's a sort of a dual use area where many people, many of the experts and many of the technicians want to keep separate nuclear energy and civilian use of nuclear materials from nuclear weapons. And I'm assuming, since this was a question about nuclear energy management, that we're leaving aside for a second the question of nuclear weapons. So for nuclear energy management, and here the question was with respect to the residues from medical applications, from a strict existential and global catastrophic risk perspective, it wouldn't be our primary focus just because we tend to focus on the types of activities that do have the global catastrophic risk to blow up many people or to lead to a nuclear winter. Having said that, though, it's still a very important topic. And I've gotten to know in Cambridge the group of people that work in nuclear engineering. And I've seen one of their reports from 2025 that was a similar question about how do you manage, say, from nuclear waste to just safety in a nuclear facility. And speaking without actual knowledge of this, I'm pretty confident that at least in most countries, there's probably a pretty specific regulations that would deal with how do you deal with the residue from medical applications. And then it would be a question, well, are they clearly stated and are they followed? But that would be my hope. And probably the doctor from governing all of Mexico City's hospitals can better answer that question. I'm just giving it from the perspective of what I know from our nuclear engineering group.
Muchas gracias, doctora Madej. No sé si adelante, doctor Spiegelhalter.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not going to answer the questions. I'd just like to make some comments on the contributions we heard earlier, which were excellent. And I'm sorry I'm not there, because I think we could have a very good discussion about these issues. And because I'm fascinated by the work being done on communicating to the public and engaging the public. Community participation is so important, as you said, to demonstrate trustworthiness and to use their own knowledge. It's the one that Donald Rumsfeld did not mention, the unknown knowns, things that other people know but you don't. And it's only by talking to people that you'll find those out. I would just also like to mention that there's really good research backing up what you said, that admitting uncertainty to people does not reduce trust and can increase trust, because they when you're discussing even vaccines or anything like that, that suddenly if you do a trustworthy communication, people who are skeptical realize that you're listening to them, that you are concerned with them. You're not just denying their concerns. And so having this trustworthy approach can really increase trust on this. And I really, I think that's absolutely vital. And as I said, I'm sorry, I'd love to know more about your communication strategies in emergencies, given the risks that Mexico City, of course, faces, which are more than Cambridge, to be honest. So it's,
Muchas gracias. No sé, doctor Baum, si pudiera considerar la última.
Okay.
Sí.
Yes. Yes, thank you. I heard two different questions with about AI that I can try to provide some answers to. From the social media, there's a question on where to find studies on the resource use, the AI hardware consumption, things of that sort. And the first place to find more about this, I would say, is just within the news media. Especially because things are changing quite quickly. The news media is the first to report a lot of this, and much of this has not yet made its way into the academic research literature. There is some academic research related to the hardware consumption. For example, there is a line of research on the implications of AI technology for climate change that will consider both the energy consumption from AI systems and also the potential applications of AI technology to climate change, though this research is not going to have the up-to-date information on the resource consumption of the current AI systems, just because things are changing so quickly. And so it's, I think, often better to look to the news media for the latest information on that. In my presentation, I had shown an article from the Wired magazine, which is an example of a media outlet that has had, I would say, very good coverage of a lot of things in AI recently. And then there was also a question from one of the panelists on how to determine the risk thresholds for AI. This is a very important question, but unfortunately also a very, very difficult question because to a large extent, we don't know where to set the thresholds. I would like to draw a distinction between two different ideas related to thresholds. In the environmental sustainability space, there is an important concept called planetary boundaries. This is used for the governance of global environmental risks. But the same idea can also apply for this with AI. And in this research, they distinguish between boundaries and thresholds. I apologize. I have no idea how well this will translate into Spanish. But at least in English, boundaries are a policy idea and thresholds are an environmental idea. So what's going on here is you have certain thresholds in the global environment, tipping points in the Earth system. For example, if there is a collapse of a glacier, the collapse of an ice sheet, things like that. Those are thresholds in the environment that once the environment crosses that threshold, you can't go back. In contrast, the boundaries are policy ideas. And so the whole concept in policy terms is to set boundaries at a safe distance away from the threshold so that you can have a high confidence that you will not cross the threshold, especially if that threshold is something that could be extremely dangerous for the world. I think the same idea can also be applied to AI. So we don't know exactly where the AI technology thresholds are. We don't know how advanced AI systems need to be before they could have some sort of catastrophic harm. And so, as a matter of policy, we should set boundaries some safe distance away from wherever the thresholds might be so that we can have a high degree of confidence that we will avoid catastrophic harms from crossing these technological thresholds with AI. Now, that said, even with that sort of perspective, we don't have clear ideas on where we might want to set these policy boundaries. I think this is something that there could be some more research on. But at the same time, we also need to have better governance regimes so that if we are able to identify good places for these boundaries, then we can actually enforce that. That's something that we don't have right now with AI, and we also don't have that right now with climate change. We have no way of enforcing that companies and other actors will actually stick to any boundaries that we might try to set for policy purposes. And so that's the kind of dual challenge that we face when considering how to determine the thresholds for AI and then to use that for policy making.
Muchas gracias. Me gustaría ver si aquí en el público tenemos ya una mano levantada, dos manos levantadas. Si podemos a lo mejor acercarles un micrófono.
Pues gracias, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Muy interesante las tres ponencias. Yo pertenezco al Colegio Mexicano de Profesionales en Gestión de Riesgo y Protección Civil, aquí en México. Y más que pregunta, quisiera compartir, sobre todo por la exposición del doctor David, que nos hablaba que tendremos que pensar en qué sucedería si, ¿no? Plantear escenarios. Y recordé algunas películas que vi después de que se declaró la pandemia, era algo que, un escenario que quizás pocos nos imaginábamos, ¿no? Y compartirle al doctor de que aquí en México estos escenarios, estos pensar en qué puede suceder, en México se llaman simulacros. Hacemos simulacros al menos 2 veces al año y creo que, a reserva de que la arquitecta Miriam, creo que nos ha faltado tal vez fenómenos astronómicos, pero sí, pensar en qué sucedería es muy amplio y pues nos toca, por supuesto, a la academia, pero también a las instituciones, a los servidores públicos, el generar esa confianza de la que hemos hablado, ¿no? Esa credibilidad de la que hablaba la arquitecta Miriam. Pero sí quería compartirles eso porque de pronto en otros países quizás esto no sea tan común, no sea tan común realizar simulacros, pero pues en México realizamos por lo menos 2 al año y sí, tenemos que seguir pensando de forma individual y colectiva en qué pasaría si. Eso sería mis comentarios. Gracias, arquitecto Augusto Valle.
Muchas gracias. ¿Que hay otra persona? Si alguien más. Sí.
Sí, bueno, muchas gracias igualmente por la invitación. Con la pregunta, en este caso, yo soy profesor acá del Colegio de Geografía y analizamos y descargamos mucha información, raster, LiDAR, diversa. Con base en la expertise de cada uno de los ponentes y que muy bien, ¿no? Expusieron toda esta parte de diversos riesgos globales. ¿Cuál ha sido la limitante a nivel nacional, local, o incluso, ¿no? Este tema de los geoportales y de los geovisores, pero no del país propio. ¿Por qué pregunto esto? Porque, por ejemplo, acá en el Colegio de Geografía, en las clases de cartografía, topografía, todas estas, se descarga, ¿no? Información de los geoportales y de los geovisores. Esta información, mucha, por ejemplo, es de protección civil de la CDMX. Hay mucha, ¿no? Información en formato vectorial, 3D, inclusive, ¿no? Hay algunos modelos. Sin embargo, a veces los estudiantes o acá nosotros como profesores nos vemos un poquito limitados en cuanto a contrastarla con otros países. Con el objetivo de analizar estos riesgos globales y específicamente la pregunta sería, ¿ustedes de qué páginas electrónicas o de qué manera ustedes contrastan información con la propia? Y cómo con base en esto, bueno, ustedes empiezan a modelar, empiezan a observar, empiezan a darse cuenta de los diferentes riesgos globales diversos que pueden existir. Y digo, ¿por qué esto a veces se complejiza mucho? Porque en ocasiones tenemos información a escala local, incluso, ¿no? A nivel calle. Sin embargo, cuando la abrimos y la tratamos, a lo mejor es muy adecuada, ¿no? La que nosotros tenemos. Y repito, acá en México hay muchas instituciones como CONAVIO, como el Servicio Geológico Mexicano, como CENAPRED, como Protección Civil de la Ciudad de México, que es información muy loable, pero cuando se contrasta con la de otros países, nos cuesta un poquito de trabajo. ¿Cómo ustedes, pues, subsanan esta, por decirlo así, limitante y cómo ustedes hacen este tipo de proyecciones diversas, ¿no? Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Ok, en mismo orden. Sí, por favor, doctora.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it linked very directly to the question of governance and how do we handle information. So as a teacher, one of the resources I've often shared with my students, it's not directly on risk, but it would be a building block, and you're probably familiar with it, is the CIA, it's the CIO World Fact Book. That's just available. It has basic information on all countries. Now, it doesn't have risk, but the reason I'm bringing up this conversation, combining the points that David and I've both made about the trustworthiness and having the good communication, is that probably if it was a different government now, then a resource like that could then build and grow so that it could start to have comparative and data and analytic tools on risk. It's not there now, and we don't even know. We know that the American administration has done a lot to take away tools that would have been there on the table. So I think this question speaks to a hunger for the information, a hunger for resources, and the importance for those of us in positions to be able to provide that. But it's going to take large institutions funding and a systematic way to put that information together. So I think it really links back to the talk by David Spiegelhaus.
Adelante,
David.
David.
Yeah, no, excellent questions. Just on the first one about the earthquake training, I was in Mexico City in 1989 and could see the damage that still was there after the 1985 earthquake. So, I mean, people in Mexico City, they know about earthquake risks, and so people were living in earthquake zones understand these things and need to be treated exactly with respect and using their knowledge, using their understanding, and avoiding any sort of premature reassurance. The L'Aquila experience in Italy, where they gave premature reassurance and 300 people died subsequently, it just made you realize how important risk communication is in this area. We had a team, part of a European team working on an earthquake risk communication, which really emphasized, making people's understanding, and so making comparisons with other times and other places, which also had earthquake risks. So you didn't compare earthquake risks with, I don't know, throwing dice or anything like that. You compared earthquake risk with earthquake risks at other times and in other places. So you kept it within when you're doing risk comparisons, you keep within the same domain, so that it carries the same emotional and knowledge, impact and emotion and knowledge. Comparing risks across countries, that's a really, really good question, because as Sonia said, I go to Our World in Data, which I think is an excellent website, but it's about data. It's about what's happened. It doesn't compare risks. And it's really good at doing very good graphics for comparing the past of what's happened. But I'm really struggling to think of where I would go for for risk comparisons between countries, and it's so important. And I mean, I know Our World in Data had difficulty, getting funding, because after COVID, it was so important that it attracted a lot of funding through that and after that. But it's difficult to know who would fund this and who would do this. And maybe there are sources I just don't know about, but I do think that's a really good issue, because it relates again back to the earthquake issue, that if you want to understand risk, you need to put them in contexts of the same context, but in different places and at different times. That's the way to understand risks, and that's why we do need these comparisons. So that's a really good idea, but I'm afraid I can't say where I would find it.
I'm just going to add just one place that works with us all the time, the insurance industry and the development banks, but it's not going to be easy to get that public. Not so far. Sorry, Seth, I didn't mean to jump in.
That's okay. I would distinguish between two different issues here. One is the challenge of pulling together the various risk relevant data that we have, and projects like Our World in Data and things like that can be helpful for that. There's certainly, you can do things like compare earthquake risk between different places. I live in New York City, and we do actually sometimes get earthquakes here, but they're tiny and they don't happen very often. Our earthquake risk is pretty low. Of course, other places have higher earthquake risk, and we have a general understanding of which places have greater earthquake risk and which places have not so much earthquake risk. But with the most extreme risk, especially the global catastrophic risk, existential risk, we're in a situation where the data that you would use for characterizing the risk, to a large extent, that data just doesn't exist. And so, like, we could ask a question of, oh, which place around the world is more vulnerable to a nuclear war, or something like that. And that's not a question that we can answer very well with data. to the extent that we have data on nuclear war, the only nuclear war that's happened in history, this was World War II, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that was 75, 80 years ago. And it's just one data point. And what we know in risk analysis is you can't really do risk analysis with one data point, especially one from 80 years ago under conditions that were very different from now. And so to be able to map out the risk of different places to nuclear war, for example, that's not something that we can do with at all the sort of reliability that you can with things that we have more of historical event data, even something like an earthquakes, where some earthquake risk involves events that are rare, but at least they have happened before. We can still say some things about the risks that different places face uh, for nuclear war. Some parts of the world are more likely to be targeted in a nuclear war. Probably here in New York City, we're more likely to be targeted than in Mexico City, which I'm not very happy about, but that's probably the reality of it. And then to other effects from nuclear war, such as the nuclear winter phenomenon, there is some scientific modeling of the effects of nuclear winter that gives some geographic distribution of the risk, especially parts of the southern hemisphere may be less vulnerable to that risk, but it's still a lot more difficult and a lot less reliable than mapping out the risks of things that are not so extreme, where we have a lot more reliable data to go off of.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Querías
Sí.
también.
Sí. Respondiendo a esa pregunta, yo creo que aquí en México tenemos muchas posibilidades de información con respecto a riesgos, riesgos hidrometeorológicos y riesgos geológicos. Uno de ellos es la Universidad de Lovaina. La Universidad de Lovaina tiene una base de datos importantísima en donde nosotros pues trabajamos mucho con esa red. Y la segunda es la Estrategia Internacional de Reducción de Desastres de la ONU, que también tiene documentación que está actualizada en este momento, tanto de Centroamérica como de México, como de América Latina, que tiene información sobre los principales riesgos geológicos y hidrometeorológicos que han sucedido en nuestra región y con los cuales tú puedes trabajar en forma permanente. Si vamos a terminar, nada más que quisiera decir dos cosas.
Sí, adelante.
Dos cosas, por favor, doctora. A mí me pareció interesantísimo lo del unilateralismo como un peligro real y las formas realmente de contrarrestar este unilateralismo con un multilateralismo en donde lo principal es el respeto único y los compromisos que deben respetarse, que en este momento no se respetan, ni hay ningún compromiso con el mundo, más que con algunos países. En el caso de SET, yo diría que el tema de los riesgos de la inteligencia artificial, tenemos que estar muy conscientes de cuáles son esos riesgos y tenemos que estar muy conscientes de cuáles son las implicaciones en política pública que existen para cada país para contrarrestar justamente los riesgos de la inteligencia artificial. Y tercero, David, me pareció interesantísimo tu ejemplo primero de Bahía Cochinos. Deberíamos también poner el ejemplo de Irán en este momento, hasta qué punto nos hemos equivocado y se han equivocado con esta guerra. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Pues me gustaría mucho darle ahora la oportunidad, se suma en este momento la doctora Frances Rodríguez Van Gort. Ella es la directora de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras. Me daría mucho gusto darle la palabra para que nos dé un mensaje pues ya de cierre de esta muy interesante conversación que hemos tenido esta mañana.
Muchas gracias, Flavia, maestra Flavia Tudela, muchas gracias. Pues la verdad es que es un gusto que esta mesa haya podido desarrollarse dentro del coloquio de primavera, este segundo coloquio de primavera. y que con un tema tan importante, tan interesante como el de los riesgos, la incertidumbre en esta sociedad, estas sociedades globales. Y pues la verdad es que ha sido una mesa de lujo, aquí con pues un abrazo para Seth, para Sonia, para David, por supuesto para Miriam, querida Miriam, nuestra heroína de la ciudad en materia de prevención de riesgos, y el doctor Eduardo Robledo, coordinador del programa universitario de gobierno de la UNAM, que es el impulsor de este coloquio en colaboración con las otras entidades, las otras facultades con las que participamos. Y bueno, que me ha pedido que dé pues el anuncio de este laboratorio que hemos creado entre el programa universitario de gobierno y la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras, este laboratorio de riesgos globales existenciales que nos va a permitir trabajar pues en este tema, en la incertidumbre que puede generar para los gobiernos el tema de los riesgos globales, ¿no? Este tema de riesgos tan importantes, de tanta profundidad, que pueden poner en riesgo pues la vida como la conocemos, la sociedad como la estamos viviendo, eh, la- 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 toda la dinámica planetaria. Así es que, pues, la verdad es que ha sido un gusto escucharles. Ha sido una muy importante sesión y muchas gracias por haber estado. Muchas gracias, Flavia, por haber coordinado esto. Eduardo y Miriam, muchas gracias a todas y todos.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Pues sin más, quiero agradecer a la doctora Sonia Madae, al doctor David Spiegelhalter, a el doctor Seth Baum, a la doctora Frances, al doctor Eduardo Robledo, a la arquitecta Miriam Ursúa, que están aquí, y a todos ustedes que se unieron, ya sea por redes, todos los que vinieron hoy a escucharles. Creo que tenemos mucho que seguir trabajando, mucho que tenemos que seguir pensando en torno al riesgo y nuestra relación con el riesgo. Entonces, pues cerramos esta mesa, pero no se vayan, porque en unos minutitos daremos la clausura a este coloquio, este segundo coloquio internacional. Entonces, si pueden, espérenos unos minutitos, aprovechemos a estirar las piernas un segundo para volver en un ratito, nada más para hacer el cierre del coloquio, si les parece. Muchísimas gracias y seguimos en unos minutos.
Thank you very much indeed. Excellent. And thank you, Sonia and Seth. It's really real pleasure to perform with you. Real